Hello everyone, this is Dr. Nisha Nujumudeen. The topic of discussion for the day is important concepts related to inflation. In the previous videos, we have been discussing some of the important concepts like stagflation, reflation, squeeflation, core inflation, headline inflation, etc. In today's class, we'll discuss another 4 important inflation-related concepts, starting with inflationary gap, deflationary gap, followed by inflation tax and inflation premium. Let's quickly have a look into what is inflationary gap in simple terms. For example, when there is a situation of fiscal deficit. What is fiscal deficit? That is when the public revenue, that is the government revenue, falls short of government expenditure. Automatically, a situation called as fiscal deficit comes up. Deficit means gap. So now fiscal deficit is a situation, for example, the revenue of government, the public revenue of government via tax and non-tax sources. What are tax sources? Direct tax, indirect tax. For example, of direct taxes, income tax and corporate tax. Indirect tax example is GST. And non-tax sources means fees, fines, penalties, etc. So now when the revenue of government from such kind of sources is, let's say, 400 crore. Whereas the expenditure the government has to incur for the betterment of the country is 600 crore. So now you can find a gap of 200 crore. So now this has to be cleared by the government in the context that the government cannot say that the revenue that they received via tax and non-tax source is only 400 crore. So for remaining 200 crore, they cannot carry forward any expenditure activity. They have to compulsorily take care of what? The expenditure activity, because it is a part of socio-economic development. So what will the government do? They have to manage this situation. So now they will resort to borrowings. So now managing such a kind of situation by borrowing from either within the country, called as what? Internal borrowing, or borrowing from other countries, but from other governments or from other international organizations like IMF and all. It is called as external borrowing. Why the government do that? The government do that to manage the situation called as fiscal deficit. So now when there is a situation of fiscal deficit, automatically what happens? Money is being borrowed. Now the money that has been borrowed by the government, slowly and gradually, what do? They start injecting them into the economy. So the money supply increases in the economy. How will the government inject? Through various schemes, programs, etc. So slowly and gradually, when the money supply increases because of this borrowings by the government, automatically what happens? The PPP, that is purchasing power parity or capacity of the people, increases. Automatically, aggregate demand also increases. Slowly and gradually, price rise or inflation, called as demand pull inflation or cost push inflation, also increases. So this situation is called as inflationary gap in simple term. Having said that, the next topic is what is deflationary gap. The opposite of inflationary gap is called as what? Deflationary gap. So now in deflationary gap, it is a situation of fiscal stimulus. So fiscal deficit is what? When the public revenue is less, whereas the public expenditure is more. What is fiscal surplus? Surplus means extra. It is a situation when the government expenditure is less, whereas the government revenue is more. So now basically that kind of situation never happens normally. But anyways, fiscal surplus means less of expenditure and more of revenue for the government. In such a kind of situation, what happens? Slowly and gradually, the economy will go into a situation where not much of productive activities will take place. And this deflationary gap will actually, in the long run, pose a threat to the growth of the economy, because such a kind of situation with less of expenditure by the government will not do any sort of good for the economy. This is called as deflationary gap in simple term. So inflationary gap is what? It is associated with fiscal deficit situation. Whereas deflationary gap, it is associated with what? Fiscal stimulus situation. Having said that, the next topic is inflation tax. So basically, inflation tax is again another important concept which acts like a tax for the people. Now, this inflation tax can be defined as a situation That is a kind of penalty, I can tell you. It is a kind of penalty for retaining currencies during higher periods of price rise or inflation. To put it in very, very simple term, I can tell you that inflation tax. Okay. Now, the government is increasing the money supply. How does the government increase money supply? Through borrowing, or when there is a limit for borrowing, automatically what will the government do? They'll resort to deficit financing. What is deficit financing? In one of the previous videos also, I have mentioned about this concept. So basically, when there is a gap, you have to finance the gap. So deficit financing is not borrowing, rather the stage of borrowing has been exhausted. So now the next is deficit financing. In simple terms, it refers to printing of new currencies. So automatically when new currencies have been printed, what happens? Money is being injected into the economy. Money supply increases. So the expenditure of government also increases. Slowly and gradually, as I told you before, the purchasing power parity or capacity of the people increases. Their total or aggregate demand also increases. So what happens? Price rise happens. Now, during this situation, what will the government do is, they will also increase the indirect taxes. For example, the indirect tax for a country India is GST. When the indirect tax increases, what happens? The price of the final goods and service, that also increases. For example, the MRP, maximum retail price of a product was 100 rupees. Because of increase in indirect tax, such as GST, today the same product we have to pay 120 rupees to get it. So automatically this is happening. So now in the situation of inflation tax, when the government is borrowing money or when the government is printing new currencies, the government is doing it for whom? For the welfare of the economy or for the people. So they are injecting it in the economy. Slowly and gradually what the government will do is, they'll try and increase what? The indirect taxes. And whatever money they have actually spent to inject money into the economy, they'll start recovering it from the people through a form of tax. What tax? By increasing what? Increasing the indirect taxes. Automatically inflation increases. Price of commodities increases. So this acts like a tax. They're injecting money, they're doing welfare activity, but again, the government is liable to pay it back. How will the government pay it back? One way is by getting public revenue. That is by increasing what? Tax and non-tax revenues. So that is collected from whom? The general public or the common man. So automatically this acts like a tax. This situation is called as inflation tax in simple terms. Now, having said that, the next topic is inflation premium. Here, the keyword premium, it talks about bonus. So you will think, what is this bonus all about, right? So now, inflation premium, it refers to a situation, or I can tell you that the bonus or the premium brought by inflation to the borrowers or to the debtors is called as inflation premium in simple terms. For example, you borrowed 1 lakh rupees today from me. Okay. Now, when you borrowed 1 lakh rupees from me, I am charging an interest of 1000 rupees per month from you. So now, for 1 lakh rupees, what are you doing? For 1 lakh rupees, 1000 rupees you're paying as interest. Now, when you pay this rupees 1000 as interest every month, suddenly, next month, what happens? Next month, the value of 1 lakh rupees, when I'm giving it to somebody else, I am giving at the rate of 2000 rupees per month as interest. Because of inflation, the value of money also increases accordingly. So now, the real value of 1 lakh rupee, when I gave you as a borrowing, it was 1000 rupees. Suddenly next month, inflation increases. So this 1 lakh rupee has now the capacity to get 2000 rupees as interest. But you who has borrowed from me is still paying me only what? 1000 rupees. So who is losing? The creditor or the lender, the one who gave you money, is losing. And you being a borrower, you are benefiting because inflation is not taken into consideration. If inflation was taken into consideration, next month when inflation increases, for 1 lakh rupees, automatically the interest to be paid is what? 2000 rupees. But you're paying only 1000 rupees. So actually you're paying what? The nominal rate of interest, which means the gross interest. You are not including interest in it. Now, if you are paying 2000 rupees as an interest for this 1 lakh rupee, by taking into consideration inflation, then that will be called as real rate of interest. So now, always real rate of interest will help the banks or the lending institutions to profit. If you see previously, nominal rate of interest without taking into consideration inflation was calculated. But over the years, in the year 2000 to 2002, what happened was like, because the banks and the lending institutions were facing issues with regard to this nominal rate of interest, they started indexing inflation. What did they do? They started indexing inflation, which means that, for example, 1 lakh rupee the bank is giving as loan to you. Instead of charging 1000 rupees per month as interest, they'll charge you 1800 rupees. So tomorrow if inflation increase also, the bank is able to somehow manage to get the money that it wants without ending up in losses, without shutting down the banks because they don't have profit. And the real value of the money is being received by them in the form of interest. So which means they're actually trying to include inflation in what? In the total amount of money. Which means in 2002, when banks decided to index inflation, automatically they start charging an interest which comes under the category called as real rate of interest. So now, this is the current scenario. But the concept called as inflation premium means the bonus or the premium because of inflation that is received by the borrowers is called as inflation premium. That is without including inflation, where you pay the interest at the rate of nominal interest rate. Whereas when the people start paying interest at a real interest rate, what happens? Automatically, you end up paying a real amount which takes into consideration inflation. I hope it is very clear for all of you. So these are the 4 important topics that are associated with inflation. Inflationary gap, deflationary gap, inflation premium, and also inflation tax. There are a few more other topics. In the next video, we'll discuss that. So whatever doubts, queries you have, feel free to put them via the comment box. And also whatever topics you feel that is difficult for you or you want me to do a video also, you can feel free to put it down in the comment box. Stay tuned for more such lectures. See you all soon. Thank you and Jai Hind.